I've seen a flying saucer.
You've seen one?
Yes,
Well,
definitely.
Unidentified aerial phenomena.
To cover up our mistakes.
I've met people who swear they've seen Bigfoot.
Join us for a journey into the obscure.
You are now listening to The Wow Pod.
All right, welcome to the show, everyone.
Welcome, welcome.
So tonight, we have now. How do you say your last name?
Sylvia.
Sylvia. Okay, that's what it's spelled like, but I wanted to make sure. We have AP Sylvia on now. AP Sylvia, he studies vampiric lore, and so he's come on tonight to chat with us about vampires, and he also authored a book about vampires, and we will make sure we include links to that. He's showing the book right there. We'll include links to the book and where you can find it, and to his websites and stuff for further, because obviously this is just going to be an introduction, as it were. But AP, what got you into vampires?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Thanks for coming.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. So I've always been sort of interested in kind of supernatural beliefs and folklore, ghosts and things like that ever since I was a kid. I always liked documentaries about the paranormal and stuff like that. So I've always sort of had a general interest about things. But what really got me interested in vampires specifically, or kind of what set me on this trajectory, was actually a visit to the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum, one of which is in Times Square in New York City. And there's a number of them around the country. I'm not sure if you've ever been to one, but they're a lot of fun. They're filled with different, curiosities and strange objects and stuff like that.
Just like on the I've never been to one. Betsy might have. She's a bit more traveled than I am, but just like on the show, it was a museum. It'd be kind of a dark setting, and then they would have oddities around.
Yeah, they have all kinds of different oddities and things, and some are kind of fun, like someone built a giant something out of bottle caps or something like that, and some are kind of maybe more macabre, like shrunken heads and whatnot. But so there's a number of them around. They've got all sorts of interesting things, and so that's right up my alley. Mm-hmm. So while I was, so this is a number of years ago now. So I was there at the one in Times Square, and one object that really caught my eye, it was this antique looking box with vials in it, and it had a stake and a mold for silver bullets and a cross and whatnot, and it was labeled as a 19th century vampire killing kit.
Yeah, we've seen pictures of those, or looked up pictures of those. Me and Betsy have. We may have shown them on the show. They're really awesome. It'd have holy water and a pistol and a stake or a knife and maybe a little Bible or those are awesome. Yeah,
they're so cool. They're so cool. So I the card for it kind of mentioned, people would take this to Eastern Europe, and stuff like that when they were traveling. And so I thought it was the coolest thing. I love the aesthetic of it. It was great. And so after that trip, it kind of came back into my mind. I was like, what's the story behind these vampire killing kits? What's the deal? I wanted to learn a bit more. So I wound up sort of, just, doing some internet searches on them. And I actually found that there was a bit of controversy surrounding them. There's a number of kits in Ripley's and other museums and stuff like that. And while some maintain that they are authentic pieces from the 1800s, others argue that they are, in fact, creations of the 20th century using vintage pieces. So like maybe someone took like, a 19th century box and, this and that and put it all together and then said, oh, this was a vampire killing kit.
Really?
So some people argue that point. And one of the arguments behind that was that, well, these kits kind of reflect, kind of modern, vampire movies and stuff like that. They don't really represent folklore. And that assertion kind of got me thinking. I'm like, well, I already knew that there were some differences between kind of what we think of as vampires from movies and TV shows and stuff like that, sort of the pop culture vampire, and what actual vampire beliefs were of the past. I'd seen some documentaries and stuff like that, so I knew there were some differences. And so I kind of wanted to get a breakdown. I started looking for like, well, someone sort of give me a list, sort of break down the modern vampire and tell me what people actually believe versus what was invented for maybe, for literature or movies or what have you. And I kind of went out there, I was looking for some kind of, sort of a list that went through it all kind of holistically, and I couldn't find it. So I wound up sort of like researching bits and pieces here and there, and I wound up kind of writing the book that I wanted to read. And so that's ultimately what my book is about. It's sort of a trait by trait analysis of our sort of vampire, sort of the traits we associate to vampires, and then well, are they actually from folklore, or are they from movies or literature or that kind of thing?
So you had to do tons of research then, because you basically created the wheel.
I suppose so. I mean, it was I wasn't seeing anything that sort of presented this information in this kind of fashion. Where it sort of trait by trait analyzed each one. I couldn't find something like that anywhere. So I did wind up doing quite a bit of research. The bibliography on my book, I think it's like 90 some odd sources or something like that. So I spent quite a bit of time reading different books and whatnot about, vampire stories and things like that, and sort of try to deconstruct what our modern vampire is and sort of figure out, well, what were the folkloric beliefs of the past surrounding the undead.
And
so go ahead, Jared.
Well, so did most of this kind of vampire folklore, did most of it come from Europe?
So there are actually vampires or vampire-like creatures from a variety of places. People often, so that their minds immediately go to Romania, Transylvania, right, Eastern Europe, and there's certainly a tradition of that there, but it's not confined to there. Beliefs of the undead, and I'll also say that the term vampire is sort of just one word for this kind of creature that, depending on the time and place, people would refer to them as different things. But you would find these kinds of beliefs, sort of, moving outward from that area. You'd see, Bulgaria, Serbia, Russia, Greece. Greece had a very strong tradition where these creatures are known as Vrikalakas.
What was that again?
Countries. In Greece, it's a Vrikalakas. Vrikalakas. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but that's.
Oh, don't feel bad. That's what this show's 90% about.
90% of Jared mispronouncing things.
Oh yeah, and it's sad. I'll mispronounce my own last name probably 80% of the time.
What's the earliest? I guess you would say folklore. And did you always believe in vampires?
Well, I think it's important to sort of say, well, in terms of belief, right? Now, I've done quite a bit of research on them. I'm personally not convinced that there are actually, corpses that are clawing their way out of their graves and attacking people or anything like that.
No, that's good, Betsy. Don't dang it that.
I'm sorry, but the thing is, it's interesting because it depends on who you ask. I found some articles from the 2000s where there was a remote village in Romania that they believed they were being terrorized by a vampire and actually took action against a corpse.
And this was in the 2000s?
Yeah, it was from the 2000s, yeah.
Like a couple weeks ago, they were hunting a vampire.
It's getting further in the past now, it feels like.
Well, yeah, but
yeah.
that's not long enough ago really shake a stick at.
Yeah, no, it's so and this was, I think, as I understood, this was sort of a remote village that sort of still had these traditions and cultural beliefs. So it does depend on who you ask, and obviously too, the notion of the dead returning and stuff like that obviously does factor into certain spiritual beliefs and things like that. So then ultimately, I think people may reach their own conclusions regarding their spiritual beliefs.
So
I've always been interested. Pardon me.
So, I mean, this is spanned from ancient Greece, so, BC times to now.
Well,
and
well, it depends. It depends on kind of how you want to start it. Starting it it gets a little tricky in terms of, well, what's the first vampire account or whatever.
Now, vampire, does that mean like strictly like a bloodsucker, kind of a big red collar on a black cape, says blah a lot, maybe turns into a bat?
Maybe. I mean, so what you're describing there is
Sparkles.
very much our modern notion of like a Halloween vampire, right?
Okay.
That's you'll see that on a store window or something like that around October. To identify vampire accounts and beliefs and stuff like that, the first thing I had to actually tackle was, well, what is a vampire? How do I want to define a vampire? Because when you start delving into legends and mythology and stuff like that, there's all kinds of creatures that kind of get discussed that maybe or maybe not are considered vampires, might have some vampiric traits and stuff like that. So I had to kind of decide, well, what's in and what's out.
Well,
That was
wouldn't
sort of
it, like a ghoul? A ghoul is, if I remember, kind of an animated corpse that likes to eat people, right? So
yeah, well, I mean, as I understand it, a ghoul would like eat the dead or something.
yeah,
like that, right?
it's a cannibal essentially, but because what would you boil down as a vampire? Would it be
Sure. Well, it depends on kind of what is associated with the belief surrounding the entity, right? So, and it depends from place to place. So, I basically came up with 3 criteria where I said, if it meets these criteria, then I'm going to consider it a vampire for the purposes of my book, of my analysis. So the first criteria was that the vampire has to be the corpse of a once living person. All right. So this was somebody that used to be alive, was a member of the community or something like that, and has since passed away. So right there, I'm excluding non-human entities like monsters and demons and stuff like that, things that were never human to begin with, or people that never died, let's say.
yeah.
So, like sometimes there's a story about like, oh, if you go into the woods, there's a monster in there and they'll suck your blood and you'll die. It's like, well, it's a monster, but it's drinking blood, but is it really a vampire? Well, it was never human to begin with. So for my purposes, I wasn't going to consider that a vampire.
Mm-hmm.
The second criteria was that the corpse has to be harming the living in some way. So I actually broadened it out from just pure blood drinking to, any kind of sort of malicious activity, any sort of, terrorizing people in various forms. Because when you look at some of these accounts, blood drinking may be in there, but other things may be discussed as well that the vampire is believed to be doing, is being accused of and stuff like that. And I feel if you just focus on stories that specifically say blood drinking, you miss a lot. And I think you miss a lot of important stories that might, inform sort of maybe the psychological roots of where vampires sort of come from. And then lastly, to destroy the vampire, action has to be taken against the corpse itself. So vampires, there's a physicality to vampires, right? They're not like ghosts or something like that, like untethered spirits, ephemeral things. They're physical things. There's a real problem. A community is facing a real tangible problem, and it's buried in the local cemetery, and people can go there and do something physically about it. And so those were my 3 criteria of where sort of how I was going to define vampires. And I think that kind of got at, with that in mind, that sort of gave me a focus and a direction for things. So, sometimes when you ask like, well, people say, well, what's the first vampire? Oftentimes Lilith comes up. Lilith from Hebrew tradition. She was
Yeah.
the first wife of Adam, who refused to be subservient and left the Garden of Eden. And then there's beliefs that she sort of turned into this like monster, like a demon, like a blood-sucking demon or something like that, would harm children and things. But like in the case of Lilith, well, she didn't die or anything like that. She's not like an undead. She just turned into a monster. So like for the purposes of my book, that's not really a vampire by my definition. But when you look at sort of the early vampire tales, for me, probably one of the earliest accounts that I ran across, an actual kind of account and a story, was from the 12th century. And it was actually from the UK. So already you're kind of outside of the time and the place that you normally associate with vampires, right? People often think like, Eastern Europe, maybe 1700s, 1800s, something like that. But here's a 12th century story from Great Britain that incorporated all of these kind of details that I'm mentioning.
So the vampire, it's so you made you boiled the definition down, so it didn't just cover every spooky
Scary
folklore.
thing.
Yeah, any kind of
Yeah.
It's
I mean,
not every single,
otherwise,
like blood drinking monster or something like that. 'Cause
Otherwise,
then
you'd have
it's
IRS
such a wide-
agents in there. You'd have, I mean, you had to disclude, So you boiled it down. So reanimated corpse, in one way or another, terrorizes, or
harming people in some fashion. They're a threat. They're a threat.
And then there has to be a physical body to defeat or to react to.
Yes, do so. Yeah, you have to take action against that body to solve your problem, essentially.
So after you've taken this scientific approach, I guess that would narrow the field quite a bit. Was there still just a ton of folklore?
Oh yeah. Oh, I mean, the thing is, it's these beliefs are in a variety of different countries. I mean, there's beliefs even from China, as I said, going all the way to Great Britain, various European countries. So and it's not like everyone got the manual that said this is what a vampire is and these are all of the ins and outs of it, right? It's not like like the movie or something. So I would actually find quite a bit of variation between different beliefs from different places and different times. And I explore a lot of that in the book. I'll mention like, well, in this place they did this, or this place they did that, or something like that. So it's hard to sort of speak of like, well, this is what people believed and that's it. It's like, well, usually there are common themes, but well, this place might have had this variation or that variation or something like that. So yeah, there's quite a bit there, because people are, kind of part of the vampires, people are interpreting the world around them, and they're trying to make sense of it, and they're sort of viewing it through a supernatural lens. And so they're going to interpret things in different ways, and they're going to arrive at some different conclusions. So yeah, I would certainly find still quite a bit of interesting tales depending on the place.
Could you, as you looked around and you saw this through all the different cultures, could you kind of see how their cultures kind of influence their folklore around it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like if the place was, if it was a Christian area, then you're going to incorporate Christian beliefs into
obviously,
surrounding the vampire, or like a cross and things like that. But if it's at a place that maybe isn't Christian, then you're not going to get those kinds of things. So it would depend on the place. I think it depended on people's experiences. I mean, like, in Greece, there, in Greek tradition, there was like an island where you would take the vampires to, because they believed that the vampire couldn't cross the water. Well, if you lived in a place that didn't necessarily have islands and stuff like that, you're probably not going to incorporate that feature. You're not going to think about that, right? So it would, people would kind of change and adapt things depending on sort of where they were And there's sort of interesting interpretations. I mean, there were even vampire incidents in New England in the United States in the 17 and 1800s. So the belief sort of, I think it probably came about on its own in different areas, because it kind of, I think, gets to sort of a root sort of, collective unconscious kind of thing of, the fear of the dead, a misinterpretation of illness and things like that. So I think people in various places, that resonates with people, and they sort of came to those kinds of conclusions.
Oh yeah.
Well,
Now,
was there a common mechanism of how does one become a vampire? Because you see in our Hollywood interpretation, you're bit by a vampire, so it's like viral, it's transferred that way.
and then you sparkle.
When you say misinterpretation of illness, how does someone in this folklore become a vampire?
So yeah, that's interesting. So that's one of my chapters is about this very thing, and certainly in modern movies and things like that, usually like you need a vampire to get a vampire, right?
Right.
Like, that's sort of how it goes down. Um, that certainly was a belief in folklore that, someone who had been the victim of a vampire may then become a vampire themselves, someone who had been terrorized at some point. Interestingly, though, it wasn't necessarily that they immediately became a vampire. There were some, like in some of these stories, it was like someone was terrorized by a vampire years ago, and now they've eventually died of something else. But because of that previous incident, they're now likely to become a vampire themselves in death.
So it waits until after they die and then reanimates them.
Yeah, it's sort of like hiding inside them or something like that.
Yeah.
But the thing is, there was actually a laundry list of other things that could make you become a vampire in folklore. People who were evil. They were just evil people. They might become a vampire. People who died committed suicide, that kind of thing, or died in a state of sin, that might become a vampire. People who did black magic, they might become vampires. Some they're just fated to become vampires. So there were quite a bit of different things. If one of them was if a cat jumped over a corpse, that might make it become a vampire. So there was
Don't say any superstitions. My husband will now. He's so superstitious. Like cats jumping over corpses now is going to become a thing in our house. That is insane. That's insane.
So
basically, it was used as
different things.
They used it as a deterrent. Like, don't do this, you'll become a vampire.
Yeah, and I think it sort of just made sense to. I think it made sense to their worldview. It's sort of evil begets evil, that kind of thing, right? Like, well, this is sort of, you are, this person was doing black magic in life, like they're going to become a vampire in death, or they were, if they committed suicide or something like that. There's a state of sin there. Now they're liable to be a vampire. So I think some of it sort of just fit into their supernatural worldview. But yeah, there was a lot of different things. There was one, in one account, there was they believed there was sort of an outbreak of vampires because a woman had eaten meat from some like cattle that its blood had been sucked by the vampire during a previous vampire incident, and so she had eaten the meat, and then she now was sort of carrying that, and then she eventually passed away, and now she became a vampire, and now she was causing more vampires.
So 10 years later.
Yeah, I think it might have been like 5 years later or something like that. So it's not it wasn't necessarily an immediate thing.
Oh, man.
That, it would suddenly happen, like in the movies, right? Where someone suddenly, in the course of days was a vampire. This was something else.
Oh, so any of us could be wandered around with the vampire bug in us. Just cruising through life. Everything's good. Next thing you know, I dig my way out of the ground.
You become undead. So
and
did
I
you
walk
travel
around
a lot
like this
in your quest for these answers, to do all this research?
I traveled to a few different places. I traveled to a number of vampire grave, or accused vampires, the graves of accused vampires in the New England area. There's a number of them there. I visited a site in Chicago. I get to see Bram Stoker's handwritten notes for Dracula in Philadelphia. That was pretty cool.
How loose was the dirt?
Yeah, I went to London. I visited Highgate Cemetery in London, which kind of has a number of different links to sort of vampire lore. So I visited a few different places, and it was always interesting, sort of actually go to the physical space where, like, where this happened, where a body was exhumed, and some kind of action was taken against it.
Some form of desecration.
So
the corpse would be mutilated in some fashion or another, depending on the place. But it was interesting to sort of just stand in this spot. There's the grave of the person. It's like, oh wow, like in the 1800s, like the community gathered here and they did something on this spot. And there's the grave of that person, and it sort of it hits it home too that these were real beliefs, and these were real people, and they were people who were very scared. They were scared, there was sort of a hysteria kind of gripping them, and they were, and a lot of times trying to save, loved ones who were ill, because in a number of these accounts, it's that, people are getting sick, people are dying, and now more people, now another person's sick, and another person's sick, and this is before germ theory, or this is before people, medicine could help them. And so they're looking for answers. They're looking for a rationale as to why this is going on, why they're being plagued. And so in these cases, the suspicion fell on the dead. And so, you can imagine sort of the desperation that people must be feeling to actually exhume loved ones and, do these do something against the corpse, like that's heavy stuff. It wasn't done lately.
I do have a couple of questions. One, could you bury him facing down and then they would just dig deeper into the earth and never find their way out?
There's an account. There was an account where they flipped them over. They dug them up and flipped them over.
See, that's the gentle way versus nailing them to the coffin or cutting their. I heard one thing they did was they cut the head off and put it down between their legs so they couldn't see. The stakes weren't there to kill it; they were there to pin it to the coffin. In some accounts, I can't say for all of them.
So that is something I talk about. That in some accounts it says specifically that they were pinning it to the ground by staking it. So it was actually
it's like it was lost interpretation throughout the years to be interpreted as this stake through the heart is what killed it, when the previous folklore was no, the stake is what held it to the coffin.
It's keeping it in there. And I do think there was some duality to it where going through the heart, the heart is a blood, it's an organ associated with blood and stuff like that. And there are other accounts where people would take out the heart and destroy the heart. So I think, sort of going through the heart, maybe for some people had maybe kind of a dual purpose of A, you're destroying this important organ, and B, you're pinning it to the ground. I think you asked me if they were brainless, right? Which is, that's interesting. They weren't themselves. This is something I do think about sometimes. Like they were sort of compulsed for this to this certain kind of behavior that they may not have been. They might not have been a bad person in life, right? They might have been a loved person, but now in death, in this condition, they had this compulsion. So there's an interesting kind of change. It affected sort of the personality and the action. In some accounts, it's not really mentioned if they're like talking or anything like that. They're just terrorizing people. But I mean, there are other accounts where the vampires do talk and speak and interact with people and stuff like that, and can I'm trying to think of the word, maybe to trick people or something like that, or kind of tell other people to do their bidding and that kind of thing. Reluctant people who are reluctant to help them, but they're scared because they're in the presence of a vampire.
Well, I learned from Sesame Street that if a vampire comes up, throw a bunch of change on the ground, you got plenty of time to get away, because the way that vampire counts is slow.
Yeah, the count's a great character. I get a kick out of that because an obsession with counting actually is present in folklore.
It is. It
Yeah,
is.
that's a real thing. And I have no idea if if the Sesame Street creators like knew about that or not, or they just, I
That's
think most people who see the count just, he's the count and he counts. It's a pun.
wasn't that the
Um,
way they got rid of that? You slowed ghouls down. Was it ghouls? I don't know. We talked about it on one. You'd throw grain on the ground.
Yeah, there were various accounts where people would take grain or like mustard seeds or something like that. They'd put
Yeah.
it in the coffin or they'd put it on the ground around the burial or on the road or something like that. And they believed that the vampire would have to stop and count every single grain.
So the
And
vampire gets up in the coffin like, I'm going to dig my way out. Not going to trick me this time. I know I'm facing the wrong way. Roll over, get ready to climb out, and then, oh, 1, 2, and then the sun comes
Yeah.
up. You're safe because it counts all
and so
night long.
and yeah, so that's they would have basically they'd spend the whole night counting,
Mhm.
and then so you're safe, and then the next night they'd be counting and stuff like that. So they had they were beliefs that vampires had these compulsions of behavior, which is interesting.
Well, what if? I mean, because that making them count stuff. Okay, the drinking blood thing, I can see where that would be a fear for every human under any timeline having your blood drank or flesh eaten, whatever.
Sure.
But the
It's pretty
counting thing, that one is very particular and not something you'd think about right off the top of your head. So that makes you wonder if, perchance, maybe there once was a. Okay, I'm going to go with I'm not going to go crazy out on a limb. Say there was, you hear the stories about people that were buried prematurely before they had died, and then whatever, the fever passes or they come out of the coma and they're alive. But what if one guy that happened to, and they just so happen to not bury him deep enough and he's beating on it and someone hears it and digs him up, but he had an affinity for counting, like he was, an ancient days accountant. So maybe, just maybe, that has a tie-in with something real.
I mean, you always wonder where these kinds of things come from because they are, some of these things are very specific. So you wonder if there was some kind of event that precipitated it. For the counting, I tried to sort of figure out where the counting may have come from. I didn't necessarily get a definitive answer. I did find out some interesting things. One thing I found out that caught my eye was that there were also beliefs that like witches also had this same kind of counting compulsion. And I was also thought that like wizards and stuff like that would have to untie knots. That was another thing that they thought vampires might have to do is untie knots.
Oh,
So you put
really?
like a net over them, they'd have to untie all the knots. But so that was actually a belief that was associated with like, the malevolent witches of folklore. And I think, from some of my research, that may have stemmed from, a belief in the evil eye, and that a complex pattern would distract the evil eye of like the witch or something like that. And then it wouldn't have power because it was, they were distracted by something complicated. So then the counting and all that may have somehow been sort of an outgrowth of that belief. And then it might have sort of made the jump to vampires because there was actually a lot of overlap between vampire folklore and sort of witch folklore and stuff like that. There weren't these sort of hard lines around them like we sort of think about in movies and stuff like that. Things could be a bit more fluid in folklore, and one sort of supernatural entity could sort of influence another. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So things would kind of grow and adapt around each other. But I do wonder where sort of the definitive, where did the counting come from? But it's certainly an interesting trait and not one that gets used very much in movies and stuff like that, probably for obvious reasons, because it kind of sort of puts a damper on it. Yeah, there was actually an X-Files episode that incorporated that to humorous effect, which
nice.
They did very well.
Well, and that's another thing. I mean, also you look at how deities were in ancient times, how the deities would have all these different traits and kind of personalities. And you would see like when Greece would come into contact with another civilization, or Rome, sometimes they would pick up one of their deities. Like Rome had, early on, had essentially all the Greek gods. And then later on, it picked up Mitra. And of course, you know, it picked up Christianity later on than that. And so maybe it was coming into contact when it picked up these different theologies. It also picked up a different bit of demonology or monsterology.
Yeah. It's certainly an interesting possibility. And you're absolutely right. Like the Romans would incorporate, or identify with local deities of the places where they would expand the empire to, where, they would see a local deity and go, oh, well, you're actually worshiping this god over here that we already have. We just call them this. You call them that, but it's the same thing. Or, they would, when I visited the Roman baths in the UK, the baths were dedicated to like Sulis Minerva, which Sulis was like the local god, and then Minerva was the Roman god, and they had just essentially combined them. So it's sort of an interesting. It was an interesting thing that sort of the Romans would do, where they would sort of incorporate these other beliefs, and and when you look at some of the vampire folklore and stuff like that, it's I certainly think that the beliefs would grow and change, and they would adapt as people got exposed to new things, or exposed to beliefs from other places.
How did your beliefs change from like the beginning, like I'm looking for a book, until the end when you finished yours? Was it just so vastly different than where you thought you would end up?
Well, I mean, there were definitely a lot of surprises when I was doing the research. I went into it knowing that there would be differences, just based upon some of the general knowledge I had, some of the documentaries I had watched and stuff like that. But the nuance there, the subtleties, some of the actual account. There were a number of actual accounts that get written down in newspapers and stuff like that, where people were, unearthing graves and stuff like that. And so those are kind of, it's powerful to think about. Like, this wasn't just some like legend from like, the mists of time or something like that. Like, people were doing this thing. Like, people were believing this in real time, and actually doing this in real life. And some of those accounts you read kind of really hit it home. So that was surprising. Some of just like the interesting variations, like, we were talking about stakes earlier. Well, in a lot of beliefs, it wasn't just a stake; it had to be a type of wood. So like in certain places, the type of wood you used was important. So some places it was hawthorn, others was blackthorn or oak or something like that. It varied from place to place, but they thought the type of wood was important. The sort of explanation for that potentially is that they believed that wood had religious significance. So they believed that was the wood that was used for the crown of thorns during the crucifixion or something like that. So that type of wood probably imbued the stake with spiritual power or spiritual authority. So you get there's a lot of nuance in some of these things that I was quite surprised by, that, kind of has been maybe watered down or smoothed over as, we kind of, as the myth of the vampire has sort of changed for modern times in pop culture and stuff like that. And then there were some things that were just, that were quite surprising. One thing I'll share was that, probably one of the most iconic things we associate to vampires is fangs, right? Like, if you're ever watching a show or something like that, and someone, they kind of smile at the camera and they've got the two canine teeth, you immediately know that's a vampire, right? Like, oh, it's a vampire. There, that's the vampire. There you go. That's what that is.
Where did that come from?
Nosferatu just had the sharp beaver teeth.
He had the two front teeth, like rat-like fangs.
Yeah.
In, Nosferatu. It was a great movie. So the fangs is interesting because it's so iconic to vampires, and it's actually not found in folklore.
Really?
There's no accounts that actually mention fangs. There are no accounts that mention like the 2 puncture wounds in the neck. They're not there. You know, in my research, most times it's never the teeth just aren't mentioned at all. It just doesn't come up. But when they are when they are mentioned, there were a few accounts that mentioned the vampire had elongated teeth, but they say teeth. They don't say fangs or canines. They're implying like all the teeth, which you might interpret to be from like receding gum lines.
Yeah, they're digging up a dead body.
Everything starts to pull away.
They've dried out. Their hair looks longer. Their gum lines have receded. Their nail beds have receded. So all the you know, what do you call it? The hair, teeth, and fingernails, all those harder surfaces look more exposed just from the drying.
Right. So a lot of I think a lot of the vampire accounts, they incorporate these details that you know, the theory, there's, you know, a theory that basically like people were misinterpreting the natural decomposition process as something supernatural. So they were seeing things that to them didn't make sense, even though it actually is explainable. And we can get more into some of those signs, but sort of just getting back to the fangs. So folklore there's no fangs in folklore. There was one belief that the vampire had like a barbed tongue, which I thought was kind of neat, like a stinger on the end of their tongue. But that's kind of it. If a wound is like in some of these accounts, if there's a wound on the neck, it's a wound, a singular wound, not like puncture marks, not 2 marks or anything like that. Where that actually came from is 19th century literature. There was a penny dreadful called Varney the Vampire, which ran for a long time, and it got assembled into like a big giant novel. I think it was in the 1840s, and that story kind of follows the trials and tribulations of the title character, Sir Francis Varney, who's a vampire. And in that story, he has fangs, and it mentions the 2 puncture wounds on the neck. So that's actually where it came from. It came from this penny dreadful from, you know, the Victorian era. And I always kind of I get a kick out of thinking about that, because it's such like a trope nowadays, you know, like, oh, like, you know, they find a victim and they've got the 2, you know, puncture wounds in the neck, and that's, you know, that's a given in a vampire movie today. But you can imagine being like a Victorian reader reading this, and that must have seemed like so innovative, that, oh wow, you know, they had fangs and it drank the blood through the holes, you know.
It's interesting. It's interesting to me that, I mean, people are filing their teeth, and it was a fictional interpretation of the folklore.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our kind of vampire Gothic imagery is you know, sort of the suave, you know, aristocratic vampire was very much influenced by like 19th century literature. That's where a lot of that kind of element came from. The folkloric vampire was, you know, it wasn't attending dinner parties or something like that. You know what I mean?
It wasn't debonair.
It was not. They weren't. They weren't known for that. Not very much. It was something to be feared. So when, you know, kind of in some of these accounts, what happens, like people would, you know, there was an illness or something going on, suspicion would fall on the corpse, they would dig up the corpse and they'd be looking for these vampiric signs. So with sort of the natural decomposition process, certain things can happen that are unexpected. Even probably people today would be surprised by some of these things. Like, you tend to think of like, okay, well, you know, somebody passes away and their body starts to decompose. They're sort of turning into a skeleton, right? They're on their way to being a skeleton. And if you look at them at any given time, they're probably, you know, on some degree towards skeleton. But in actuality, depending on various conditions, the condition of the body and stuff like that, different sort of surprising things can happen. For one, gases can actually build up in the body, and so the body can bloat. So imagine that they would uncover, you know, they'd sort of dig up this corpse and they'd uncover them, and it would look like the person had gained weight inside the grave,
like they'd been eating.
They'd been eating. They looked, you know, and the face could look flush with blood depending on position of the body and stuff like that. So they have this red face and they'd be bloated, and they might look like healthier than they did. They're like, oh, this, clearly something's
He's
wrong here.
younger.
They look good. They're looking good. So they would view that as, the corpse is stealing the vitality from the living. Another thing that could happen would be that they would see blood around the mouth. Which can happen in decomposition. That fluids can come out through the mouth. Sorry if this is getting a little graphic.
Oh, it just
yeah.
It escapes.
Yeah.
Whatever
Wherever it can.
Wherever it can.
They'll
And
have
so
blood
people would
around other areas too, probably, or they'll have
So-
liquid that.
Yes. They'll have fluids. They'll have these purge fluids coming out, and so people would see that and go, "That's the blood they're drinking from the victims." So they would see these signs, and then suddenly, what were they to think? This must be the cause of the problem. I mean, there was in one of the accounts from New England in the late 1800s, they looked at the body of this 19-year-old woman who had been dead for a few months, and she looked fresh. She looked as if she had just died, and to them that was unnatural. So and then another sign would be, is there blood in the heart or in the organs? So they would cut open the body and check to see if there was what fresh blood, or what they interpreted to be flesh blood in the organs, and that would be a sign that something was amiss here, that vitality was there when it shouldn't be.
And let's remember, they're digging up someone that they probably knew and possibly cared for.
You can appreciate the fear that drives this kind of folklore.
Absolutely. I mean, so one of the graves I visited was the grave of Mercy Brown. And this was she was buried in a town in Rhode Island. And so in the late 1800s, she was 19-year-old. She passed away from a disease that was then known as consumption. We know it today. We call it tuberculosis. Her mother and her older sister had passed away a couple of years prior. So all that was left of the family was the father and her grown brother Edwin. Now Edwin was also sick with consumption. And he had gone to Colorado for a while because they believed that the dry air might help with it. It didn't. He came back. He's getting sicker. And there was nothing medicine could do about this, right? The medicine didn't have any options for him. So people in the community, talked to the father, I believe his name was George Brown, and they said, it could be the dead. The dead could be causing this illness in your son. And we need to we need to dig them up. We need to examine them to see if that's the case. And at first the father, he refuses, he doesn't want to do it, but eventually he gives in and lets them exhume the corpses. Right. And, his son is dying. Right. So they exhume the mother, his deceased wife, and they exhume the older sister. Both of them had decomposed to the point that they were beyond suspicion. But Mercy, who had been dead a few months, and I believe she died like in the winter months, she looked her body looked fresh. She looked, as if she had just died. Right. And so to them that was suspicious. They then removed her heart and I believe her liver, and there was blood in it. The people believed that it was fresh blood. The doctor who or the medical examiner who didn't really want to have, I think, anything to do with this, but was there, said that it was coagulated and it was to be expected. But that was enough for the people to think like, okay, the daughter Mercy is causing Edwin to be ill. And so this is the root of the problem, right? We're getting back to this whole thing of there's a corpse, this was a once living person, it's a corpse that's causing harm, and now something must be done to the corpse itself. So what the people did is they took that heart and the liver, they burned those organs on a rock in the cemetery. They took the ashes and mixed them with water, and then they gave them to Edwin to drink as a cure for his consumption. Unfortunately,
it didn't work.
It did not work, and he passes away. And the papers kind of get wind of this, and then there's a number of articles written about it, and it's kind of, it gets, kind of sensationalized or something like that. And obviously, to the modern eye, we look at that and go, oh my goodness, what were they thinking? But you can imagine the desperation, especially of this father who's lost, he's lost his wife, his 2 daughters, and now he stands to lose a son. And there are people around him who are telling him, this is a way to save your son. I mean, how would he feel not having tried it, not having, feeling that he had not done everything he possibly could have to save his son? So you can imagine the desperation there.
This poor bastard is dying of tuberculosis, and they feed him liver and hard ash from his sister, and he's got to choke that down. And
yeah, I mean, it's quite surprising.
Just the mustache alone is enough to make you gag, let alone swallowing it. And
it's quite surprising.
Did they tell him what it was? Did they say
I would presume he knew what it was, but the story does not say. But the thing of it is that same belief I found stories around that in Romania. So that was actually that same belief of consuming the ashes. Actually, we presume traveled from Romania all the way to the New World. So you can kind of see some of the power of these beliefs.
Sure. Tell us about vampire hunters.
Ooh,
I mean, you started with kind of viewing this vampire kid. Is there anything that historically says that there was actually people who maybe were designated by others or designated themselves as the hunters of these creatures?
Yeah, so in some of the accounts, it's usually the community the community are the ones that are kind of doing this and kind of taking whatever action fits with their beliefs and their culture. But there actually were some stories around people who it kind of was like their job. So I don't know, in some sort of movies and stuff like that, like in some movies there's like a half vampire, right? Who's like part, they're like part vampire,
he's like
part
generation
human.
Removed.
Well, that's what Blade was.
Yeah, like in Blade, right?
Yeah.
So there were beliefs that a vampire could father children with like their widow or something like that. And it was believed that the offspring would have kind of a bit like they'd have like sort of power against the vampire, or they'd be able to like see the vampire. Like in some accounts, vampires like invisible. And
takes one to know one kind of stuff.
Yeah, kind of. So it was, and so that they were like, there's some different names for them, like a Dhampir or something like that. But the thing is that kind of that ability or that trait of being able to sort of hunt vampires or deal with vampires was actually inherited. So you might actually be dealing with someone who they thought they had like a vampire ancestor generations ago. But I read one account there was like a family who people believed that they were descended from a vampire, and they would go to them and ask them for help if there was a vampire that was threatening their community or something like that. So there are some accounts of that. There was another account I read where there was this town that was being terrorized by this vampire that would like make a lot of noise at night. I think the term they used was Vricolakus. I think this was in Turkey, and so it was the vampire was like making like a ruckus at night essentially, and the priests couldn't do anything, no one could do anything, and then they hire a sorcerer from out of town to come in and deal with the vampire. And the minute the sorcerer shows up, the vampire is suddenly gone. And the person writing the story believed that the whole thing was like a scam, that the sorcerer and the quote unquote vampire was it was all just a big act, like they were working together.
Generations later, they're calling you about your car warranty.
Generations.
We've traced it back.
So there were some folks who were, I guess, in the occupation of hunting vampires.
That's cool.
I'm sorry, I'm still hung up on drinking the ashes of your sister.
I was gonna be dreaming about that.
It's heavy. It's heavy stuff.
The guy, he's like dying, coughing up blood, saying I'll be your huckleberry and such, and then to top it off, dear old dad comes in with the mug. And
well, you would have to. I mean, we're in a different time frame. You've lost everything already. You're trying to hang on to, to grip tightly what you have left. You would have to do it.
Yeah, I mean, again, you just try to put yourself in the mindset of someone they know they're dying.
Yeah.
And somebody in the community, you presume they're well respected, is saying, this could cure you. This could save your life.
Yeah.
What are they, what are they going to do? And and one of the interesting things about vampires is in these cases, suspicion falls upon the dead, right? Like, I'm sure it was, very traumatic, emotionally traumatic, psychologically traumatic for those involved, but the actual person that they're sort of mutilating is already dead, right? It's a corpse that the blame goes to. But I mentioned sort of the parallels with, the witch, witches, beliefs in witches, in those cases, suspicion fell upon the living, and now you actually have people, persecuting and executing other members of the community, because they believe that there's something evil or malicious present.
Well,
it's like they leveled up.
And in a lot of
in the witch
instances,
trials.
in a lot of instances, the witch trials were used for personal gain of the prosecutors. Like the Salem witch trials, there was a lot of personal gain of the prosecutor involved.
It's interesting where you could see, like, grudges or something like that playing out in those ways, which is obviously very very disturbing. But Salem's a fun town to visit. There's a lot of fun attractions there and stuff like that. Different, like wax museums and different things. And I visited Salem on a number of occasions, and it's a very very interesting history there. And there's a lot of, like, Halloween's huge there and stuff like that. So that's an interesting place to go, especially if you're into Halloween as a kind of a fun destination.
Sure. Oh, I'm sure.
So what's next for you? I mean, this is like you were totally interested in something and you just like broke it all down. What's next?
you did it. You wrote the book you wanted to see.
I did.
You filled the market.
So, next up, it's hard to say. I have a blog, Locations of Lore, where I talk about, different places I've visited and some, like, the folklore or, legends or just kind of interesting things about them. So that's something I've been putting my writing efforts towards a bit. And, that there's a number of, like, some of the places I talked about with the vampires. You can read some of my articles there and see my pictures of some of the graves and stuff. But there's other things there too, like ghosts and different sort of other supernatural things. In terms of, beyond that, I have a few different ideas kind of rattling around my brain for, what I want to explore next for maybe another book or something like that. But I don't know. We'll have to see how it goes.
I dig your scientific approach to this. I'm excited to get the book.
Thank you.
And to check it out. I think anytime we're afraid of something, if we can break it down to, like all of its parts and pieces, where did they start? What was happening at the time that they started? It takes all the fear out of it. I think vampires are the same. There's still a huge following, though. We have a vampire club here in Utah, where they
really,
they meet once a week. They actually partake in the blood drinking. They file their teeth. I mean, these clubs are all over the place. So this is a everlasting folklore.
Yeah.
I mean, it resonates with people in a lot of different levels, and and I think part of the reason why it's still around is that the vampire has adapted, it's evolved, it's grown and changed over time. Where you went from the folklore of these
He's sparkly now.
Yeah, they made him
it
sexy.
It changed through literature, movies, and and even things like put it this way, like talking about sort of modern vampires, it's hard to say, like, it's hard to say anyone had a bigger impact than, like, Bram Stoker with Dracula in terms of our modern kind of notions and stuff like that, right? Like, his shadow looms large over any kind of vampire tale. But in another 100 years or something, would people be saying the same thing about, like, Twilight? Like, oh, if it wasn't for Twilight, we wouldn't have this whatever thing that comes out now. So the vampire is always sort of changing to meet the needs of the audience, whether it was a community that was being ravaged by some unknown ailment, whether it was 19th century literature where the vampire grew into this kind of suave, sophisticated monster that could now show up in your home at your parties and stuff like that and infiltrate high society. So it was dangerous in a different way, in a way that resonated with the readers then. Or, like nowadays, where the vampires kind of, whether they're a high school student or something like that, it's whatever resonates with the audience.
So it goes to whoever would read it. So whoever would consume it. So you have small village to upper echelons of society who knew how to read and could afford to buy books, to teenage girls. I dig it.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's
it's
reverse
evolving.
It speaks. I think it just speaks to people. I mean, one of the things nowadays that's often emphasized with vampires is their immortality, right? You see a lot of shows where that's kind of a big aspect to the vampires, that they're immortal, they live forever. Other people actually seek out the vampire, maybe serve them, hoping that they'll be made vampires and thus immortal. That gets played up a lot, right, in like movies and stuff nowadays. And I think one of the reasons why that is because I think that speaks to us today culturally. We don't need vampires to explain illness and stuff like that anymore. That's, we have answers for that. Science has solved that. We have answers for that now. But science hasn't solved aging and getting old and dying. But so when we watch a vampire show, there's someone who has subverted that. They're not subject to that. But by doing so, now they're cursed. Right? Yeah. Now they can't live a normal life. Now they have to live off the blood of others, and they can't go out in the light and things like that. They live a cursed life. And I think that speaks to us too.
They're always wealthy because of their long life, but they can't enjoy that wealth.
They live apart. They live apart from the natural worlds. And so I think that resonates with people today, that that there is they've lost, the vampires lost their humanity.
Well, before we
folklore of today will be somebody's what the hell were they thinking of tomorrow.
Well, before we go on to a couple listener questions, what is your favorite folklore from your book? Your favorite individual story from it? The one that kind of, I don't know, excited you the most or scared you the most or made you think the most?
One of my favorite stories from it was actually I referenced it earlier. It was from the 12th century in Great Britain, and it's a very old tale, and it revolves around this fellow who he was thought to be evil, kind of like an evil. He was known to be kind of an evil guy in life, sort of a wicked fellow, and he believes that his wife is cheating on him. So he devises a scheme where he tells his wife he's going to be away for a few days, and instead of leaving, he hides in the rafters of his home up in the ceiling so he can spy on her. And while up there, and she's her lover comes or whatever, and while the husband's up there, he loses his balance and falls to the ground and injures himself. And the wife tells him, you're not well, you didn't see anything. And so she gets him to his bed, and he's actually severely hurt. And so they end up calling for a priest to come to give him last rites, and he refuses. He just can't deal with it, and that must come back later. But before the priest comes back, the man dies. Mm-hmm. And so you actually have a formula here for a vampire. Not by modern standards, but by some of those folkloric beliefs that I mentioned earlier. He was believed to be wicked in life. He died in a state of sin. He didn't commit suicide, but he sort of died by his own actions. And so he's a prime candidate to become a vampire. And that's exactly what happens. His corpse starts rising up in the night. They don't use the term vampire, I might add, but his corpse starts rising up in the night and walks through the streets of the village. And it says that like a pack of wild dogs kind of follows him around. And so everyone starts staying inside because they don't want to be attacked by the dead man. Unfortunately, that doesn't keep them safe because as the story goes, his breath poisons the air. And so a plague descends upon the town. and so people start dying. So over the course of time, many people die, many people just flee the town, so there's not many left. And so the remaining village, they decide that they're going to gather and sort of discuss what to do. And these two brothers who had lost their father to the plague, they decide while they're all meeting, we're going to go and take action because it killed our father and it's going to kill us. So they dig up the corpse of the dead man, and as they're digging him up, they pierce him, and all this blood starts coming out of his body. And they say that it was as if he was filled with the blood of many people, he was a giant leech filled with the blood of many people. They actually in the Latin version they use the term sanguisuga, which translates to leech, but quite literally translates to bloodsucker. And so they take the dead man. They take him outside the village. They remove his heart and tear it apart, and then they burn the body. And by burning the body, it sort of has this purifying effect on the air, and it purges the plague from the village, and thus everyone is saved, thanks to the actions of these two brothers. And so I like that story because it's got all these sort of essential elements of like a vampire tale, but again, it's from 1100. So that's I think it just goes to show you sort of the longevity of the vampire and these beliefs.
So
that's crazy.
I mean, he was a bloodsucker. He carried like a poison on him that poisoned everyone. Did they say they witnessed him walking the streets?
This is from the 12th century, so this tale is very old and probably has been exaggerated in various ways. But that the story says that he was walking through the streets, so people were staying inside. Otherwise, for fear of being attacked by him. And it's a very
moral-oriented story. Like the wife did wrong. There's an adulterer aid in there. There's him being
all of the talking points.
A jealous bugger. It's got the morality of two brothers taking it and taking care of business. It's all,
It's got a lot of it's got all these great elements to it, of even just beyond a vampire story, just like a general good story, where, you could see it being turned into like a movie or something.
That one would that would be much better than Twilight. Much better. All right.
But did he sparkle?
Yeah, did he sparkle?
Does not mention any sparkling on that.
They didn't have a word for that.
That's our generation's addition to the vampire folklore.
Yay us.
So I have a question from one of our viewers. They want to know if you have created your own vampire kit.
Ooh.
I have not created my own vampire kit. I actually do. I have two that they were made by artists in the modern era. They're not period, or they're not claimed to be period. But I have two. One was a gift, and another I purchased myself. And I think they're great. I think they're fun. They're fun talking points, and they look cool. They look cool.
Yeah, they're way cool. We want one for the podcast room.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, you should get one.
Yeah.
If you check Etsy, there's some folks, at least in the past, I've seen people have made some kits that they've put on there.
That's cool.
Yeah. Another question: what are your thoughts on werewolves?
So there's actually the last. I think it was like the last chapter of my book is talks about witches and werewolves and their overlap with vampire beliefs. So that kind of gets back into what I was talking about earlier of different supernatural beliefs influencing each other. So like, for instance, vampires were believed to turn into wolves, be able to turn into dogs, actually, as specifically said. There were also beliefs that a person who was a werewolf in life, after death, they would become a vampire. There was a belief in Brittany where an undead corpse would eventually arise and kind of erupt out of the ground as a wolf. So never a person anymore, just a wolf. So you can, so like right there, you have an undead person turning into a wolf, right? So like a werewolf. So you can see there's all these kind of these parallels and sort of between vampires and werewolves and stuff like that. And so I talk about that. I talk about beliefs surrounding silver in the book and things like that. So you can see how they didn't live in a bubble. Like these beliefs didn't live in isolation from each other, where the people who are thinking up witches or werewolves, and when I say witches, I mean like the malevolent folkloric witches of folklore, not like not like practicing Wiccans or something like that.
Yeah. You mean the ones that kiss the devil's rear end?
Those.
Yeah. So the folkloric beliefs, which are present in in the past and stuff.
Which
like that.
I mean, let's face it, some of them some of the things that they got put on trial for was they danced.
Yeah.
Or well, I mean, yeah, crazy stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as from what I understand about it, from some of the research I did for my book, but obviously my book was focused on vampires. But some of the things I read, there is a belief that sort of people who in sort of pre-Christian times who had certain beliefs around who knew about or believed to know about like predicting the weather or ensuring crops and stuff like that, who had hidden knowledge, those kinds of beliefs and practices got demonized over time, with the introduction of new religions and stuff like that. So that may be sort of how the malevolent folkloric witch kind of came to being.
Oh yeah.
So for our listeners, his book, I actually just picked mine up off of Amazon. It's Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go, and there'll be a link to the book in the show notes. Also a link to his blog and website.
Yeah, super cool.
All of his collection of the Facebook and all that stuff. We'll add links in there so that whichever method you prefer to follow him on, you can follow him. And you could keep up with it, and I'm excited to read the book. I dig the lore. It's just fun.
I love the approach. So many people, when they're researching, the approach is not scientific. The approach is not, let's categorize this. Let's, quantify what belongs, what doesn't belong. I really like the approach. I'm excited to read it. I like that scientific way of looking at the esoteric.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Whatever it is.
Yeah, I thought it was a unique approach myself, and that's what I was looking for. I was really looking for a trait by trait breakdown in a very organized kind of fashion, and so I thought sort of the way I presented it in the book was sort of different and unique, and I think kind of a fun way to digest it.
Definitely. Now, I'm excited to read it.
After you've done all this studying of the lore and all that stuff, and you've done the scientific route, okay, they experience this stuff, and you explained it away, and then you find out vampires are real.
What?
It's a big world out there, so never say never.
Yeah.
I think if they are real, they'll present themselves differently than sharp teeth and a red cape. I doubt they sparkle.
Well, if I see a
we do embalm people nowadays, so maybe that's taking care of it for us.
It could
be.
But if I run into a vampire, I'm gonna ask him for a piggyback ride, because he climbed that mountain quick with that. I mean, granted, I'm a little larger than
how fast they run.
Yeah, but,
that's right.
Build
again,
like a.
Well, maybe
they were probably super slow in folklore, slogging around much like Frankenstein, and now we've made them fast. We made zombies fast. I I don't know why not vampires.
Oh man.
Why not? I think it's whatever you need to up the ante in you know,
Yes.
the movies and stuff like that.
Next
That's
level.
the thing.
Betsy
You gotta add something.
Betsy doesn't like the fast zombie trope.
Fast zombies are an abomination to zombies. They gotta be
Like
slow.
slow lumbering.
They can't communicate.
Sure.
They've got to lumber along so that even I can get away. I mean, you just can't make fast zombies. They drive me crazy. Whoever thought of that?
Oh.
Straight to hell. Abomination.
Straight to hell. We're not giving you last rites either.
That's it. That's it. You've crossed the line.
Well, and
You
also
can't have fast zombies.
like with the witches thing, you look at it. You brought up a good point where dancing was normal in a lot of religions, but in Salem, they were all Protestants, or some of them were probably Calvinists even. So dancing definitely wasn't allowed, at least back then. And so a lady that would dance, especially alone in the woods, she would automatically be seen as evil, as well as maybe not evil, but not proper.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, and I'm certainly not an expert on the Salem witchcraft trials. I've been there, you know, been there a number of times and, you know, visited some of the museums and things like that. But, you know, I think there is that their lifestyle and their worldview was very different from ours, right? They believed that the supernatural world had a very real presence in their lives, right? Like that's like you know, oftentimes people today in our modern times might not necessarily you don't necessarily think in those terms, but in the past many people did that. You know, the supernatural, sort of the war of good and evil could play out, you know, in your community, that kind of thing. And they lived by kind of a very, you know, strict guidelines. So people who kind of lived outside the norm in any kind of fashion, you know, if they live, you know, like an elderly woman lived alone and was, you know, kind of rude to everyone or something like that, as I believe one of the initial victims was, you know, they were sort of, the community looked at them as, you know, with suspicion, you know, and then obviously when, you know, this hysteria gripped them and, you know, these girls are going into fits and the doctor says, there's no medical reason for this. It must be, you know, the devil or something like that. Well, then that's suddenly you've opened the door to a lot of, you know, kind of fear and, you know, really kind of the darker elements of people.
Well,
think,
that
you know, kind of come out in that.
And if I remember, the prosecutor got the land of the people convicted.
Yeah, I think there was something where I do believe that someone
so
was
he pushed
getting
it
land
hard
from
too.
someone that
So
had,
they came at him from
they
every
accused.
direction. That one guy, what was his name, Betsy? That they set the door on him and then stacked rocks on it.
I can't remember his name, but they tortured him,
But
and he
wouldn't confess
he
because
wouldn't
if he
confess.
confessed, his kids lost his land to the
Yeah.
prosecutor. So when they asked him to confess, he would say,
Giles Corey, is I believe the person,
Oh,
and his
okay.
whole deal
There
was
we
that
go.
he didn't want to put in a plea because it like. If you put in a plea, you were like kind of locked into a certain scenario where, like, you know, if you said, you know, they take your land and, you know, you'd either go on trial and get killed if you said no, and if you said yes, then he forfeited things. And so he just wouldn't put in a plea at all. So they used the torture of pressing to try to get him to do a plea.
and did
right?
he say
And
more
he,
rocks?
and he never pleaded. They were just piling, you know, they had the board on him and they were piling rocks. And I think at one point it says his tongue like bulged out and, like, you know, the person in charge took their cane and shoved it back into his mouth. And I think his last words were more weight.
Yeah.
So it's quite the story. I've heard tales that I think his ghost is believed to kind of haunt the cemetery, and I think it's his ghost that is said to be seen like before tragedies or something like that.
Like the
So that's
Mothman.
he's the forebearer of the area.
It's
So there's an interesting.
it's road trip
you know,
time.
there's some ghost stories around in Salem, obviously.
It's road trip time, Betsy. We'll get a white van.
Salem is way cool. Salem is way cool.
I will park in the
It's
next
interesting
town
to go
over.
to Boston and you'll be walking along. There's a big building, and then there's a graveyard. And then you're walking along, and then there's a skyscraper, and then there's a graveyard. It's an interesting place. It's an interesting
Yeah,
place,
it's
for
cool.
sure.
It's cool where you've had this interesting mixture of very old and very new, where suddenly you'll walk across like an old burying ground. I mean, there are a lot of different surprises.
Yeah.
I mean, like Paul Revere's house is still there. Like,
Yeah.
oh, that's cool. Yeah.
The great molasses spill that killed people.
Yeah.
I
There's a lot
went
to
I
that.
went on a
Yeah.
tour, and I laughed hysterically when they were talking about it. I was like, it's molasses. Like,
Yeah.
run. How did the
Apparently it was
molasses?
But
But it was a tidal wave.
Yeah, it was like a tidal wave of it. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Apparently, I think some people say they still it can still be smelled in some basements or something like that.
Yeah. Well, molasses is pretty strong, but the whole area itself, the way that Boston was built up from the harbor, and it's an interesting place for sure.
Yeah, the roads kind of go off in different directions. Some of the driving can be interesting because obviously it's it grew over time. It wasn't like a planned city with like a standard grid or something like that.
Right.
Some of the older areas kind of they twist and turn a bit at times. But yeah, it's a really fun city. And there's certainly a lot of great history. Especially American Revolution and stuff like that. I always say if you're gonna come in the summer.
Yeah.
Or maybe
For
the fall.
sure.
People like the autumn, you can see the leaves and stuff like that too. But if you come to Boston and if you're interested in these kinds of things, then you can also take the trip up to Salem. And you can kind of see, the different sort of things they have there and get into some of the history and stuff like that. And, you can visit, Salem has a ton of stuff, and also the neighboring town of Danvers, which was part of Salem back in colonial times. It was Salem Town and Salem Village, and Danvers changed its name. But, that there's also, sort of locations relevant to the witch trials there.
Very
Yes.
cool.
Yes.
Very, very cool.
Thank you so much for coming on. Thank
Yeah.
you very
Thank
much.
you so much for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, and
Interesting.
when you
Boy.
get your next thing going, if you write a book about witches or something else, please reach out. We'd
I
love
will.
to have you
Thank you.
back.
This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and,
Yeah, it was nice to meet you. This is a cool subject. I can't wait to read the book,
yeah.
and we'll include in the show notes how everyone can, find the book, find the blog, and kind of follow along.
all the links to AP, get you tied in with them. If this is a subject you're interested in, jump on there and reach out. Let us know if you've got scary vampire stories, if you've come into contact with the blood-sucking undead, or
If you are a vampire, we'd like
reach
to
out
hear
to
from
Betsy.
you.
That is
We've
Betsy.
tried to have interaction with a couple of the vampires that are a part of the local clubs, and they're shy vampires.
And also,
They don't
we're
want
old
they don't
and-
want to talk to
and we
us.
go to sleep early. Sometimes
Yeah,
it's
it's true. It's probably more likely the issue is I go to bed far too early.
Yes. Well, thanks again, AP. Again, look in the show notes. We'll also we'll link to his page from our page on Facebook, and there'll be links to his blog, where to find his book, and he's done quite a few other interviews. So if our podcast,
If you have other questions that maybe we didn't answer, it's
Yeah.
likely in one of the other interviews.
dig through them. All right, thanks, and everybody have a great night.
Have a great week.
Yeah, great week.
Thanks, AP.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Not a sign of human. Why does it feel kill? Not a sign of human.